Senator Scott, I want to thank you for your willingness to participate in this conversation. You're being viewed not just across America, but across the globe. And obviously, something significant has happened to this country. I want to personalize it. I know that you had challenges when you were younger. Can you explain, as a way to enter into this conversation, why you were able to overcome such tremendous difficulties when you were younger and what that informs you of now in this conversation?
Well, thank you, Frank. It's good to see you again. And my goodness gracious, you look fantastic. So good. So good to see you healthy and thin. Awesome. You're now my model for the future. I'm going to try to match weight loss a little bit.
No, don't. I should be a model of nothing. I can
You're so
tell you
funny.
that.
Well, let me just say this, though, that you have done what you have been the answer to the question you've asked. I know that some of the folks that you have mentored in the past, they've interned in my office. It's been inspiring mentors that really helped to reshape my life as a kid that was born in poverty, single parent household, hopeless, frankly, from 7 when my parents divorced until about 14, failed out of high school because I felt like this country, my community had nothing to offer me. And my mother's prayers and my mentor's words started blending together to tell me that anyone at any time from anywhere in this country can rise beyond their wildest imagination. And so my mentor started asking me, what are you dreaming about? What are you doing about those dreams? Are you waking up and going to work? And I had a terrible answer. I told him that I had I had a bad hand. I didn't have the right cards, that life was not going to work out for me. He said, listen, and he slowed down and he said the most powerful thing I'd ever heard. He said, if you look in the mirror and blame yourself, not your dad because he's not around, not your mother who's working 16 hours a day as a nurse's aide, changing bedpans and rolling patients just to put food on your table. If you will take responsibility for yourself, you will find that, yes, there are some problems that start on the inside, but the promise starts there too. He said that you see the obstacles in the mirror, the opportunities are there too. He was teaching me this important concept of individual responsibility. That literally became the new foundation for my life. And then I realized that the harder I worked, the luckier I got. I also realized that the more I believed in people, the more they believed in me. And so, as corny as it sounds, there's a truth that either it's your mind's eye or your physical eye. If it's your mind's eye, you start on the inside and it works its way out. And if it's your eyes on the outside, you start on the outside and that starts to creep in. And so these were just simple philosophical lessons with the foundation of prayer and hard work. All things became more likely in my life.
But Senator, it isn't fair in this country. And I understand your philosophy behind this, but if you're African American, you don't have the same opportunities. If you live in certain neighborhoods, your healthcare is worse, your education is worse. You do acknowledge that there is a disparity in this country.
Oh, 100%, Frank. I would never say that there is not a difference in communities. Unfortunately, you look at my opportunity zone legislation, the one thing you'll find is out of the 8,700 designated communities, like 56% of them are majority minority, even though the country is 12% or so African American and about 15 or 16% Hispanic. In those areas, you'll see that in the poorest, most distressed communities, absolutely, people of color seem to have it worse than most people. Our poverty rate in America is around 13%, probably a little higher because of COVID-19. In the African American community, it's 28%, almost 30%, twice as high. Homeownership reflects the same statistics. But what I am saying is that it is 100% true that more times than not, the color of my skin has an impact on the potential I have in this nation. That's true. The question, though, that I oftentimes hear people struggle with is racism the problem or is racism an problem? I think it's just one of the problems. It is not the major problem. If that's true, if racism is the problem, that means that all the cards necessary for my success, it's in the hands of somebody else. I have to reject that philosophy. If I say that it's not a problem at all, I'd say in South Carolina, we'd say, you're just smoking weed. But I'd say for me to be honest and a realist, I have more influence on my outcome. The question is, do I have the foundation for that outcome to be as positive as possible? That's why I always talk about the importance of powerful, strong education systems in the poorest zip codes. It's why I talk about the necessity of workforce development and the necessity of embracing the gig economy, the necessity of things like broadband in rural America. A lot of white kids don't have connection issues. They have connection issues. Inner cities, a lot of poor minority kids, they don't have connections either. So when we start understanding that this country is the greatest economic engine on earth, that this country has more freedom than any other country on earth, the question is, can we bring those as assets into the poorest communities? I think the answer is yes. And we have to struggle from a position that it can be done, as opposed to struggling from the position that it's going to be hard, it will never happen, and most people will never escape it. That's just not what we have to have as outcomes.
So I'm going to go into policy in 1 second, but I got 2 more questions.
Yes,
for
sir.
you.
Yes, sir.
Have you been racially profiled since you were in Washington?
I have been. I said recently on the floor, I've been stopped 18 times in the 2000s. I've been stopped coming into the Senate office building. I've been stopped with my Senate pin on. My colleagues in the Republican conference, and frankly, the ones in the Democrat conference, have all said they have never been stopped, and they don't even wear a pin. So literally, I've been asked for my ID while driving into the congressional buildings because they didn't believe I was a member of Congress. I said to one officer, that's either a felony for trying to impersonate a senator, and who would want to do that anyways, or it is in fact who I am. So I refused to show my ID on the 4th time that I was asked for. I just didn't do it. And the third time, 4th time, they didn't ask for the ID. I just said I wasn't going to show it, so they just let me through. So, these things happen. I could go through, being followed in grocery stores or being followed in retail stores. People think I'm going to steal something, even as a senator. I can talk about being pulled over this year for failing to use my turn signal earlier in the lane change. I didn't know that was a thing. But I could talk about walking on streets where people start clutching their purses, and I literally sometimes just go as far away as possible. I'm not looking for any unfortunate situations. I don't want any confrontations that are unnecessary. All that said, we still have to focus on solutions as much as we do the problem. And I'm concerned because right now, without us acknowledging the problems, they will get worse. With only focusing on the problems, we're focusing in the past. For us to focus on the present, we have to focus on solutions and problems, and really in that order, because I think we have more solutions than we have problems.
And there are some people who now want to tear down statues of Thomas Jefferson because he was a slave owner, George Washington because he was a slave owner. And you walk past, because it's there in Washington, and you walk past the Washington Monument, the Jefferson Memorial. Do you have resentment? Is this because it's affected you personally?
Yeah, I certainly say I don't. I think we should all remember the past. We should remember history. I don't know that we should always celebrate every part of the past. We should not celebrate every part of history, but we should remember it. I don't have an emotional response when I walk by a statue, no matter who the statue is. I had an emotional response when I saw the Lincoln Memorial for the first time, and the second time, and the third time, and the fourth time. I had the same impact when I saw MLK's statue as well. They just speak so much of what we can be. But I'm from a state where Ben Tillman was a racist and a terrible person. But you know what? I don't think about what he did or didn't do in the past. I really think that if we're spending a lot of energy on statues, we should take that energy and spend it more often on building a better future for those kids. I'm not opposed to having a conversation about renaming bases that were all named for Confederate generals. Sure, we can have that conversation. But will that conversation manifest in more scholarships for poor kids? Well, that conversation, I'd rather say, okay, I'll give you 3 statues for 300 scholarships. I'd rather cities and counties, instead of giving the public works department more work to do, pulling it down, instead of spending that money in that direction, why don't we actually provide more charter schools in the poorest neighborhoods, more connection to those poor kids? Why don't we actually, instead of pulling a statue down, why don't we put up a statue of someone besides Martin Luther King Jr., someone besides Rosa Parks? Why not Booker T. Washington? Why not Washington Carver? Why not actually, instead of replacing history, why not add to the history of America? Because these were powerful forces for good in America. So I would rather have a conversation about Booker T. Washington and the universities that he started than me talking about tearing down some statue that's not going to make my life any better. That may be a minority opinion, by the way, but I think you only have a finite amount of energy. You have infinite possibilities, but finite energy. And the question is, how should I invest my energy into an infinite outcome versus a finite past? That's just my personal perspective.
Well, it is not a perspective that we see on most network television. It's not a perspective that we've had over the last 3 weeks. I want to read a quote, and I apologize for doing this. You know I never read, but I want to get it exact. This is what you said on the Senate floor less than 24 hours ago. This process is not broken because of the legislation. This is a broken process beyond one piece of legislation. It's one of the reasons why communities of color, young Americans of all colors, are losing faith in the institutions of authority and power in this nation. Why are we so broken, and how are you going to fix it?
Well, we're broken because we focus so much time and attention on Washington, D.C. as a place where solutions come from. That is a false paradigm, and most often those dreams won't come true. I'm in Washington because I think I can make a difference. I don't come to Washington because I think that we are the difference. The truth of the matter is, I was having a conversation with a victim's family earlier this morning, and we were walking through the legislation. They had said that they were not fans of the police reform legislation. And I asked some important questions. The first question I asked is, can we actually talk about it and not yell about it? And they were like, of course. And so they started asking questions on why I didn't include the chokehold in my legislation. And I said, I did. They were like, really? I said, yes. They said, well, what about the data collection? Their loved one was lost by a gun. Someone, officer killed the person. I said, it's actually in my legislation. And they were like, well, we didn't see that on the news. We didn't. And I was like, you know what? People are so busy that if we don't give them a good synopsis, a thorough synopsis, they may come out against something that is actually very different than what they expected. What happens in Washington is we have these echo chambers. There's a Fox echo chamber. There's a CNN and MSNBC echo chamber. And if you don't see it on your preferred channel, it must not have happened at all. If you don't hear it, it's really not true. That is toxic for our nation.
But how do we change that? But how do we change that?
This is where I'm heading. I would rather have an objective standard that allows me to speak to all people at the same time. But since I cannot, what I have opted to do is spend more time talking to minority media, spend more time on CNN, spend more time actually having a conversation, because what ultimately occurred in the Senate yesterday was they didn't reject the legislation. They rejected who was sponsoring the legislation. Not just me, because I'm an African-American conservative. That does play a little bit of a role in it. But the Republican Party should not have any good ideas for minority communities, because of course, all Republicans don't like minorities. I like my mama, I like my brother, I like my cousins. Literally there's this notion out there that is a false narrative that somehow your Republican Party identification, your Republican Party label is easy to demonize and stereotype. And I said last night, if I don't want to be stereotyped as an African-American man, I certainly should not stereotype people because they're Democrats or Republicans. If you're against stereotyping, let's be against all stereotypes.
So let's do policy, since this is a very sophisticated audience. your opportunity zone legislation. Tell me, is it working the way you expected it to work? Mike Milken and the Milken Institute has been focused on this now for years. And their priority at Milken is to get capital into underserved communities. Is it working?
It's working very well. COVID-19 hit it pretty hard, i.e., it delayed some investment decisions, rightfully so. I worked with Treasury to actually create more of a relaxed environment for the rest of this year for the use of funds and for the investment of funds. So the good news is some of the landmarks as relates to investing those resources have been delayed for the rest of this year so as to not penalize those investors whose funds can't be deployed because of the uncertainty and the lack of predictability in the marketplace. So that's really good news. But to the foundation question, $75 billion in private dollars, all investor dollars, not government dollars, heading into over 8,700 distressed communities. The actual legislation that creates an incentive for people to do what would not necessarily be the highest and best use of their resources, but with the deferral of the capital gains tax and then a stepped up basis in the capital gains tax, you now have the incentive to take a second look at a place that typically doesn't bring the type of return that you would want on the resources. By doing so, we now have one of the greatest engines in the private sector humming for the poorest people in the country. That is good news. And there are a number of projects that you all have heard of, whether it's in South Dallas, a $400 million project, 2,000 plus jobs, a $1 billion project in Memphis, Tennessee, in Little Rock Hill, South Carolina, a $500 million project bringing workforce housing and affordable housing into a little city that says, according to the mayor, a fairly liberal buddy of mine, he says, we have not had affordable housing in the downtown area of Rock Hill in 30 years. Because of opportunity zones, we're going to have a chance to help people who work downtown live downtown. That story repeats itself all around the country. That's good news. So the opportunity zones are actually working. We just need more investors doing more work so we see the ROI for the community as well as the investor.
But there are a lot of Democrats who claim that opportunity zones is simply putting money in the hands of multimillionaires and billionaires, and that's not what the government should be doing.
Well, the one thing I've often asked myself was how many in my neighborhood where the unemployment rate was around 30% when I was growing up. I often asked myself, which one of us were going to create the job without capital? And looking back, the answer was, of course, none of us could. We all needed some investor to come in and do something that we could not do for ourselves. Give me the resources to make a difference. Help me start the business. Help improve the property so that we can have chances to open businesses. Let's bring in infrastructure so we have the necessary infrastructure to open businesses, to see them blossom. So I would say to those folks who believe that opportunity zones puts more capital in the hands of investors, yes. Why? Those are what we call job creators. If you don't have access to capital, if you don't have margin in your profit, you typically don't get it from your income, then you typically are unable to invest. It's one of the reasons why I have stressed the importance of an incentive-based economy. As we come out of COVID-19, we actually need more incentives for investors to get off the sidelines as it relates to an unstable, uncertain economic environment. The way that people invest in those turbulent times is by having certainty and predictability. Good policy helps, but certainty and predictability are essential. And so opportunity zones really provides some of that glue. And if we're going to have the kind of success we want throughout the country, it's going to require us to rethink, reimagine economic mobility and focus our attention at the bottom and the top, and let's meet in the middle.
But this is not, when I listen to the representatives of Black Lives Matter, this is not on their agenda. Why are they not focused on this? Why do they not see this?
That's a good question. One of the things that's on their agenda right now is defunding the police. What we have to recognize about the whole effort to defund the police is the poorest, most vulnerable communities need character-driven law enforcement, perhaps more than the most affluent parts of our nation. So defunding the police only means there will be fewer resources to protect the 98% of the folks who live in the poorest communities, good, hardworking Americans, love their families, love their country, and just want a safe pathway to and from their homes. In those communities, we need more officers, not fewer officers, number one. Number two, I would say this, that if we're going to get beyond the BLM mantra of defunding the police and focus on what actually creates wealth in America and wealth in the poorest communities, we're going to have a conversation about the inverse relationship. There's an inverse relationship. The higher the taxes, the lower the revenue. We've proven that for the last 100 years in this country. And that inverse relationship works in reverse. The lower the taxes, the higher the revenue. So when we cut taxes in 2017, we actually saw an increase over the last couple of years to the United States government. But what we also saw, which may be more important to minority communities, is we saw lower taxes plus a deregulation for a responsible level of regulations led to 7 million jobs being created in this country. When you have a full economy, full employment, what happens when you create 7 million jobs is you start seeing an uptick in the labor force participation in the African-American community and the Hispanic community. So 7 million jobs, 2/3 went to Black, brown, and women in this country. That tells me something that's really important. The conversation around increasing the minimum wage, the conversation around the next social program that will save poor people. Actually, the full economy led to the type of outcomes that people have been clamoring for a long time. Said differently and more practically, McDonald's, Walmart, Target all raised their minimum wage beyond what the Obama administration was fighting for. Why? Because the economy, when it's full, it drives wages up and production. When you increase production, you get higher wages. When you increase artificially higher wages, what you actually do is you start cutting jobs. And where do you cut them? At the bottom. And so when you increase the minimum wage from a government by fiat, you actually reduce the number of jobs in the economy. When you don't increase the minimum wage by government fiat, you allow the economy to do it, you actually end up with more jobs, higher wages, and more participation in the workforce.
The two aspects that matter most in the communities that are underserved, one of them is the opportunity, job, investment, and capital, and the other is education.
Yes.
There is a difference, and this is one of my greatest frustrations. There is a difference between the schools, both in rural communities, and you see it in South Carolina, and in urban areas. Both students are being forgotten, they're being underserved. They're not, in some cases, not graduating from high schools. The high schools aren't worth the graduation, the diplomas. They cannot do those jobs that we need them to be able to do. So how are we going to change the schools? I know that this is not a federal issue, but maybe Washington's got to do something.
Well, I do think Washington can provide more incentives. It's the same thing that we do in most of the police reform work that I've been doing over the last several weeks. It's clear police reform, for the most part, it's a local decision because the federal government cannot force local departments to do something. In the same fashion, federal government cannot force local and states to do something about the terrible education that the poorest kids are getting there. But we can provide more incentives for change. One of the easiest ways to see the kind of change that we need, really systemic change in education, is by introducing more competition in education. The good news is in rural America, in the inner city, because of things like the coronavirus, we may actually see a 1,000-year leap in the use of technology and connection to bring about the best and brightest teachers into rural America and the inner cities. And so we have to focus our attention on creating a competitive environment where charter schools are available, where virtual schools using technology, they're available, and you're not just stuck with a failing school system because you can't move out of the poorest zip code in America. If we can change that outcome, your parents may not be able to move, but we can move in through technology the best teachers, the brightest minds into the poorest areas. This would be revolutionary for our country. Because when we're competing against countries with 1 billion plus people, we need every hand on deck. We need every mind engaged in the process of realizing its full potential. We need human flourishing at the highest level ever imagined. If we do that, we will remain the superpower on earth. If we don't educate the poorest kids in the poorest zip codes, it will be our fault that we lose the preeminent position on the globe.
We're down to the last 5 minutes, but Senator, year after year, schools in New York and Philadelphia, my city, LA, Las Vegas, we talk about fixing the schools, but there's so many in communities of color that are actually opposed to charter schools, that are opposed to the reforms that you're speaking of. How do we get over that?
Well, honestly, Frank, this might be the easiest question you could have asked me. Thank you for saving the best and the easiest for last. Of the kids,
there's still one more.
Okay, of the kids going to charter schools and a school choice here in DC, African-American parents' satisfaction with those charter schools that are producing the highest educational outcomes for the poorest kids in the poorest areas, their approval rate is around 77%. Hispanics are near 80%. So what we need is actually more kids entering into the competitive environment of charter schools and high quality magnet schools. When that happens, the parent satisfaction goes through the roof. And that's a good thing. Frankly, in Philadelphia, I think they have a charter school that focuses first on language skills. They're learning like Arabic or some languages, a base language for the kids. And these kids are 99% African-American kids. I think most of them males. And they are in the top like 10% of the nation for understanding a very unique historical language. In New York City, the success academies, the charter schools, public charter schools, 81% minorities, 90% free lunches of these kids, 41 schools, I think, around the state. And these kids are finishing the top 5 in English, math, and science in the state of New York. Let me say that differently. In Detroit, kids of color are passing the proficiency test around 13% of the time, 15% of the time, and around 20% of the time for math, reading, and science. In Success Academy public schools, the charter schools that get like 50% of the money, those kids are finishing in the 70 and 80 percentile.
And why is the Democratic mayor of New York, the very first thing he did when he got elected was to attempt to abolish those schools?
Because they work. You have to remember what I said yesterday on the floor is unfortunately the most dangerous thing I could have said. It is simply this. It is not what we're talking about, it's who's talking. In order to control the outcome, they have to control the vote. That is not cynical. That is just reality. Anytime the party stands up for those kids, it's a dangerous place to be. We are saying, sorry?
Keep going, keep going.
Yep. So Eva Moskowitz, who started Success Academies, is, according to everyone and her, she's a Democrat and perhaps a liberal Democrat. She got so frustrated with the lack of quality education, she started Success Academies. And who's attacking her? Liberals are attacking her because she's challenging not teachers, but teachers' unions. Not whether a system should be focused on kids, but why is it focused on adults? These are simple questions, simple challenges, but she's confronted an onslaught of negativity and maliciousness because she dared to tackle a foundational issue of control.
There are, you know, that when you do a Milken event, you've got very successful people. And in this case, these are people who want to make a difference. These are people who want to address the issues that you've raised. What do you tell the Milken community? What do they do over the coming weeks and months to make a difference, a meaningful, measurable difference?
Well, the first thing I would do is say, keep doing what you're doing. Most, having spoken to Michael Milken a couple times, his commitment to helping small and minority businesses get off the ground, access to capital, significant impact, positive impact. Without entrepreneurs in the neighborhoods, it's going to be hard to fight the unemployment rates and the hopelessness rate that we never measure. Second thing you can do, of course, is to listen, to put yourself in a position where you are talking to people who are not like you so that you can understand and appreciate anew their dreams, their aspirations, and the shortcomings. My mentor, the Chick-fil-A operator, caught me when I was 15 years old. And for the next 4 years, he taught me that profits are better than wages. Who knew that at 15? I didn't. He taught me that creating jobs is better than having a job. Literally becoming a mentor. Frank, you've done this. You should answer this question yourself. You've done this. Becoming a mentor to people who feel that the system doesn't work for them. Don't give them something that they haven't earned, except your time. And then teach them how to earn even more. That will change our nation faster than most of the decisions that we debate and never come to in Washington.
It's indescribable how much respect I have for you and the impact that you are having. But how do you get through honestly, how do you get through the day when you have so much, the things that you believe in are not necessarily what the community is articulating?
Yes.
Philosophically, you're a man of faith, you're a man of principle, you're a man of values. You and I have had a number of conversations about the importance of faith. As a way to close this, because we have to bring it to a close, how do you get through the day when you're under so much pressure by people who you would think might agree with you and don't?
Well, you know Frank me pretty well, and I thank you for your friendship too. You are an amazing person, and you say it better than most of us will ever say it. I don't even try to reach your levels that often anymore, but I'm going to try right now. 3 quick answers to that question. My faith is my foundation. I know why I'm here, and I know what I'm working on. My friends in the Jewish community have taught me the importance of reading the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch. And Deuteronomy 8:18 says that God has given us the power to create wealth that we may establish his covenant. Said differently, when we have resources, or if we have the ability to create resources, it should not be for our selfish ambition. It should be to serve a greater cause. I embrace that. I may not have the wealth, the resources that the folks on this call have, but I have a resource called a talent and a strong desire to influence people. I think that's a gift from the good Lord, not something that I earned, but something that came with me. I have worked hard to cultivate it. I've worked hard to nourish it. But ultimately, if I use that talent to create opportunities for others, that keeps me motivated. The second thing I'd say is right out of Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Lean not on your own understanding, in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your path. So for me, it's easy to be motivated and energized when I realize that I'm sometimes like a goose lost in a rainstorm. So the best thing I can do is turn to people who know more than I. And so I try to surround myself with a great cloud of witness, or said differently, a lot of strong mentors and advisors who have been where I'm going. And then finally, I look at the New Testament, and it reminds me the golden rule in Matthew 7:12, which is simply to treat others like you want to be treated. So even when people are treating me in a toxic way, it is my responsibility to treat them as I would want to be treated. And sometimes that includes righteous indignation. Sometimes that includes being angry, because sometimes you need to put it back on them. So it's not a message of love that is just emotions. It's a commandment to be your best for others. And by doing so, we'll make the world and frankly our nation a better place.
Senator, we need you. Please stay healthy. Please stay in Washington. I know that this country is blessed because it has you serving it so well.
You're very kind, Frank.
I want to thank the Milken people for watching, and this is the end of the broadcast. Senator, have a good day.
God bless. Love those shoes. Take care.
Thank you.